Billet Tarkovsky is a partner at McKinsey & Company. Edward Latson is the Chief Executive of Opportunity at Austin. And Mark Hunter is the Chief Executive of Harmonic Bionics Incorporated. Thank you all for being here. So we'll be discussing three main themes on this panel today. We'll be discussing how global challenges have changed the way that executives view and manage their supply chains. We'll be looking at strategies that firms can employ to reshape their supply chains and how businesses can leverage their supply chains as strategic assets that can help their businesses as a whole. So maybe, Ed, I will start with you. Put you on the spot because we're here in Texas and you work here in Texas. You champion the interests of local manufacturers, and I'd love to hear how you've seen executives in Central Texas reacting to some of the changes that are happening in the world and some of the issues that you've been facing.
Yeah, I mean, Austin has been one of the fastest growing industrial communities in the country over the past 20 years. And over the last 5 years alone, our tech sector has grown 65%. And it's a very globally integrated community. 50% of our manufacturing is electronics. We have a very strong, robust semiconductor cluster. And they've been very impacted by the global events, whether it be COVID or geopolitical situations or even local weather. So the supply chain executives have really been at the front of that. And I think overall that they're an incredibly smart and adaptable group. And we've seen pivots from maybe more extended supply chains to a lot more localized approach. And whether that's a regional localized approach or an extended region going into, say, Mexico as a potential supplier, I think you see a lot more appetite for those kinds of connections. And it's really, I think, brought a lot of strength into our community. So while it was painful getting there, I think we're at a really positive state right now.
Roman, I'll turn to you. You lead the global energy practice for McKinsey. What changes have you been seeing in how executives are viewing their supply chains, and what kinds of strategies are you seeing to address them?
No, that's a great question. And I think we've been through a most disruptive period, right, in recent history for many executives. And I think one of the quotes I remember from one of my clients was, after 20 years in supply chains, he told me someday, like, this has been the toughest time as a supply chain leader I had in my entire career, right? And that was sort of where we were about a couple of years ago. And I think there's kind of pro and a con to that, right? I think the con to that is, of course, lots of supply chains really suffered, right? Disruptions, inflation, scarcity. At the same time, I think people frankly started appreciating the value of what supply chain brings to their company, because in many ways it was taken for granted by many industries. And I think what Elise Marie was sharing, right? That's on the cutting edge of what's happening in many industries, right? For many companies, supply chain was just a given, right? You assumed your suppliers will be there. You assumed you had a contract. It will be met, right? Things will get delivered. And it was a huge shock to the system when, Eastern European supply chains sort of collapsed, right? And were cut off from the world, right? Suppliers just stopped delivering, or they were coming to you. And I had an example of a client where a supplier came and said, hey, I know we have a contract. Here's a 50% price increase, and if you don't want it, I got 40 other customers, right? And this is how it is. And that's the world we were in. And so people started quickly realizing, like, hey, my supply chain is not set up for success in a world where there's volatility, there is kind of edge events happening. And so how do we change the fundamentals of how we think about supply chain procurement and our strategies and get a lot more sophisticated? So I think that realization is there. I would say whether we're on track to actually making those changes happen, I think it's pretty nascent still. There's still a lot that has to be done until most companies are actually ready to face what may be this kind of continuously more volatile and challenging world.
Mark, Harmonic Bionics is a medical device manufacturer, and you have worked in supply chains for many years. So tell us your perspective on this from the supply chain, being in the trenches in the supply chain.
Sure. Yeah, I've spent 20 years in med device manufacturing, and medical has not necessarily always been on the leading edge of innovation. Maybe still not. But I would say historically, there was an overemphasis on cost and efficiency and an undervalue of risk management. It was always there, and we did our annual supply chain risk assessment, kind of understood what our general, we partnered with folks like McKinsey to do things like that, but it was more of kind of a check the box activity. And I always told my team, it's usually not your tier 1 suppliers that'll kill you, it's your tier 2 suppliers. It's the ones that are behind your suppliers. And the good part about that is I think if you're willing to go ask questions and poke on things a little bit and go have conversations with your suppliers, they know where the risks are. You just need to ask. And you need to map that and understand where your vulnerabilities are, both from a planning, procurement, labor, logistics standpoint. But I think you can learn more about your supply chain than it might be obvious.
That's interesting. Could you say a bit more about how you've mapped that, what that looks like?
Well, so I'm kind of an operational guy, and so I like to go talk to the operators on the line. Honestly, it's kind of a Japanese philosophy in Gemba. Go and talk to the hidden factory because they know stuff. They know where the vulnerabilities are, and I think I can sit in my office and pat myself on the back, thinking I know what the problem or where the problems are, and you have to have the humility, I think, to go to the factory, go visit your suppliers, go talk to your logistics partners, your 3PLs, and understand kind of what are they seeing and try to understand how that could impact your business. We face some, so my previous company was actually in diagnostics manufacturing, so I was literally making COVID tests and PCR tests through the pandemic, and so my job was at the intersection of global supply chain disruption and PCR manufacturing. So it was a rough couple of years. So, but we weathered it, and I had a great team. But I think coming out of that, I think there's a more balanced approach to risk and efficiency. Those are kind of somewhat at odds, but I think there's an ability to strike a balance there.
Ahmed, I'd love to bring you in. Bahrain is part of this supply chain globally right now, and so it'd be really interesting to hear your perspective on what you've seen over the past few years.
Well, representing being the face of the investment promotion when it comes to the Kingdom of Bahrain, our job is to attract companies, whether it's manufacturing companies or it's logistics companies, and the two obviously, go together. And we have to talk to companies and listen to them to see what do they need, what sort of disruptions. And Romani just said something really nice, is that people were taking things for granted. And we saw post-pandemic that everything has changed. And the need to address the disruptions, the vulnerabilities, the need to be receptive to a paradigm shift. So one of the things that we do is we go and talk to companies, we see what are their needs, and we also go to talk to our stakeholders in the government and see how can we address those needs, how can we make life easier for them to conduct their businesses. That's the only way that we can stay in competition. We're lucky to be in a region where there is a lot of growth happening, and to keep our edge, in terms of being slightly in the competition, we have to be, on top of our game and see what are the niches that we need to address to make sure that we're competitive enough for companies to come and look at the kingdom. So again, it's mainly the communication, the open communication that we have, and one of the things we are really focused on is making sure that we know our limitations and we know what we are good at. And what we tell companies, if we cannot do something, we will tell them. We'll let them know we cannot address your situation. But the ones that we can, we will go and emphasize on it. And we have also the advantage of, we are a small island, yes, but then we are very agile. We've got the advantage of quick decision making and centralized decision making as well. That helps us as well in trying to address the problems that our investors are looking for.
Roman, when you see companies adapt successfully and become more resilient, what are some of the key factors that you notice that run throughout?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is a hard problem to solve, right? I think one risk companies run is you're trying to solve a complicated problem. There's no easy solution for that, and so you can't oversimplify it, right? And I think there's been a lot of, we went through a period of firefighting essentially, and so you were patching up holes kind of as things were happening. What it mostly led for a lot of procurement and supply chain organizations, and I'm curious about your experience, right? You can only firefight for so long until the operating model becomes stressed to a limit. At that point, you have to take a step back and say, we need to rethink how this works. And what do we mean by that, right? You need to think about your people. You need to think about your processes. You need to think about technology, right? There's never been an easy button to solve a complex problem like that. So companies that have been successful were able to take a step back and say, I cannot just plug in a technology tool that's going to solve all my problems, right? I cannot just presume that all my people are the right people in the right roles, right? So unless I address all of the aspects of this problem, what I generally find, it's like you're squeezing a balloon, right? The value is going to leak somewhere. You're going to kind of squeeze all the parts of it, if you will. And so you got to address really all the fundamentals of the problem, right? So, if you're trying to rebuild a supply chain, what does it mean? Let's figure out what do we want to accomplish and what are the outcomes, okay? There's sustainability, there's resiliency, there's value, there's many outcomes now. The scorecard of many CPOs or supply chain leaders went from, savings plus kind of not messing up on the other things to there's 10 KPIs now I'm responsible for. And then how do you deliver those 10 KPIs? I have to look at everything. That's a complex problem, but if you can orchestrate that approach, right, there are proven solutions to all of those things, right? I think the companies need to have kind of the courage to really challenge things that are in place for historical reasons and go approach them with the right level of expertise and kind of high enough aspiration, right? So.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think software tools are amazing, and I've used some world-class software tools, but I think you've got to understand the message behind the numbers. So I think that looking at KPIs are incredibly important, but there has to be kind of a breakdown of that and understanding what's the real message here. And I agree. I think I've seen my previous company grew from 100 million to 400 million, and the people that kind of got you to this level may not necessarily be the people to maybe to this level. And similar in terms of business processes. You have a business process that scales to a certain degree, and then it breaks, and you have to structurally change the way you're doing things. Otherwise, you're literally limited in the ability to serve customers.
It's interesting you bring up this issue of software tools. I think a lot of people, we were talking earlier about, and sort of everyone wants the silver bullet that'll fix all of their supply chain problems. Amit, what about in Bahrain? How have you seen the role of technology playing out in the challenges that we've been facing?
So we've seen companies, adapting and going, going for Industry 4.0, and that's something also the Ministry of Industry and Commerce is really focused on with an initiative that so the government is putting a team that goes out to all of the manufacturing companies. We've got north of 300 manufacturing companies in Bahrain, and they'll send out a team, look at the existing facilities and how ready they are to shift and transfer to automation or the use of robotics and whatever. So that's one thing that the government is addressing. We also have a labor fund called Tamkeen, and that labor fund gives a lot of incentives to companies. So including they recently launched a new package, a much bigger package than previously, and one of them is to address these issues of Industry 4.0. So they will address, if they need funding required if they need borrowings from banks, then they have a certain program that will help in financing. If they need to train their staff to go towards automation and the use of robotics, then they will also support in upskilling the talent there. So, and once they get the manufacturing facilities will get the certificate that now they are Industry 4.0 approved, then that also gives them a lot of advantages and other things, whether it's in contracts with the government, or a lot of incentives that they could be also given from our labor fund. So again, it's addressing the needs of our companies, our investors that came to Bahrain for the purpose of either manufacturing or logistics or whatever. So it goes again that we talk to them, we look at the gaps, and we try to address them as a government.
Yeah, I would add too, one of the things we're really excited about in Central Texas is the innovative economy that's emerged here. I mean, I think there's been 29 unicorns that have grown out of Central Texas in the last 5 years. And there's some really interesting things happening on the supply chain and manufacturing front. I'm specifically thinking about ways that companies are organizing small and medium-sized suppliers across the country, bringing them onto a platform, so when you have a big OEM, they can put out a proposal and have all this untapped capacity around the United States, going after that, and coupling that with some neat things happening on the automation of the procurement process and communication between suppliers and OEMs, and I think these things are going to drive evolution, and it's neat to see it coming out of Austin and the region.
And I've talked a lot about that. It's so important to have a deep network of talent as well as suppliers locally. And I can't be successful if I don't have the right raw material suppliers feeding my factory, or logistics partners being able to move product to customers. And so the interconnectedness of the network is really important regarding location. And I think Austin has really grown under Ed's leadership, and I think that the future's bright to continue to make that network more robust.
Well, and I think the point, and what we're seeing is that a strong ecosystem, is a force multiplier, and it sounds like you're seeing that too in Bahrain. But as the ecosystem grows, the potential possibility of individual businesses, are just maximized. And so, as a company that attracts business, we see people pulled into that, specifically around semiconductor, electric vehicles, life sciences in Central Texas. So.
I want to talk a bit about managing costs. We are in a very uncertain economic time right now, and there is this emphasis on how we can manage costs through efficiencies in the supply chain. What are some of the best practices that you've seen in terms of cost management without losing some of these other adaptations that we've also seen a need for in terms of building in redundancies and flexibility? Maybe Roman, I'll start with you.
No, for sure. I think that's the fundamental question, right? And I think in the last few years, when the price lever was taken away from many companies, everybody sort of learned that, hey, there's a lot more to the question of cost than what it used to be. Because for a while we were in a world, and I literally had clients, right, where the role of procurement was send an RFP every year, get 2% reduction, sign a contract, and move on, right? That was life for quite a while. And then when you send that RFP and you got a 20% increase in half the capacity, you started asking fundamental questions about, what your job really entailed. And so I think one of a few best practices we learned, first of all, is it cannot be done in silos. I think a lot of companies still very much fall in a trap where functions run in silos. Procurement's not talking to engineering's not talking to sales. Everybody has different forecasts. You cannot optimize costs like that. Many of my clients, the supplier knows more about the product and what they're buying than the procurement folks themselves, right? That happens all the time. And so then you're looking at it, like, how do we reduce costs? And they're like, I don't have any drawings. So you got to look back and say, hey, do I have the fundamentals in each function? Do my functions actually work together? Do I understand the proverbial total cost of ownership, right? Like, what are the implications of the different decisions to my business? And then all of that leads back to what we were talking about, what you just said, which is, do I have the talent able to do it? I think what happens a lot right now is it's a completely different ballgame. What we used to do and what we're doing now, within 3 years, companies realize that most of my talent actually doesn't know how to handle this. It was easy to send an RFP. If your RFP is taken off the table, a lot of procurement folks were like, what do I do next?
Yeah.
What is my role? How do I create a cross-functional workshop about cost reduction and do engineering ideation or whatever it may be, right? So I think that was, some of those best practices I think have to become table stakes, and we got to retrain our people to do it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Every one of your comments. I would share three thoughts, and I learned this very early on in my career at Intel, who was wonderful in how they manage supply chains, is multiple qualified suppliers. Is ideally you're going to be sole sourced on certain items, and you're not going to have leverage, but to the extent you can, having multiple qualified suppliers that you can leverage, 70-30 volume, and there has to be a healthy tension that suppliers know that they don't have the business for the next 15 years, because that's not going to drive efficiency. I would agree with your point, Roman, that the suppliers know. Like, if you have the humility to go and ask, you say, okay, we have a long-term partnership. I need to reduce costs by this much. I need to get to this point. What can we do? And they'll often have 3 or 4 ideas. Well, if you could open up this tolerance, or if you could change the way this comes together from a design standpoint, this would reduce our setup time dramatically. Oh gosh, didn't even know that. And you have to be able to go ask those questions. And then finally, I would say a perspective of total delivered cost, including logistics. Like, it's easy to look at purchase part price and your manufacturing cost, but packaging, delivery cost, all the way to the customer can be a significant add-on to just what your cost is as it exits your factory.
Tell us a bit about when manufacturers are looking into a new market, maybe that they haven't worked with before. What are some of the things that they can look for, or ways that they can approach that?
Well, I mean, probably, as my colleagues here are saying, cost is definitely one of them. The other thing is, do they have enough business demand for them to come and establish a manufacturing facility somewhere? And in our case, we think that we have a strategic location that, and we provide access to companies that come to us. In doing so, we need to have the right infrastructure of logistics. We need to have the right infrastructure of, whether it's utilities, whether it's an industrial zone that could accommodate them or not. But also, one of the things that the kingdom has done is that at the moment, we have a zero tax policy. So we have zero corporate tax, zero income tax, zero capital gain tax. 100% foreign ownership is open in almost all of the activities. So that by itself is a cost-saving formula for companies to come. Again, we give access to the wider MENA, GCC and the wider MENA region. So you've got, access to more than $2 trillion of economies around you, more than 440 million customers, and we also have free trade agreements with covering more than 24 countries, one of which is with the U.S. So a manufacturer in Bahrain can export to the U.S. duty-free, and as well as 23 other countries, so long as they fulfill the local content. So again, it's a combination of small things. The other thing that we are really good at is that talent, and you will get local talent, and that's one of the important things that one of our greatest value propositions is the availability of local talent. But we are also receptive to having expats. If you look at our population, we are around the 1.5 million population, half of which are expats. And one of the things is that we believe in is the transfer of knowledge. So we really want expats to come and transfer their knowledge to our Bahraini talents. And we don't have a hard policy on, if you want to come and establish a facility in Bahrain, we will not tell you you have to hire Bahrainis. What we will do is we have a soft quota. We will make Bahrainis the employees of choice. by upscaling them, making sure that they have the talent required. And then even if you think that you want to take those Bahrainis and send them, take them to the US to train them, and we've got incentives. We will take care of their training. We will take care of upskilling them. We will pay for the whole trip. And then once they come to Bahrain and you think they are ready to be hired in your facility, then our labor fund will come and support their wages. So a number of incentives that we are offering to make sure that Bahrain is conducive for businesses.
I'd love to pick up on this question of upskilling because it's something that everyone is facing right now. Do you have any lessons that you could share about how you've upskilled or retrained people in the population?
One of the examples that we, or one of the greatest success stories that we have is Citibank a couple of years ago, wanted to have a global tech hub. So Bahrain was shortlisted among other cities, probably other cities that are very well known for coding and that sort of talent. The reason eventually Citibank decided to come to Bahrain is one was the availability of the coders, the quality, and one of the most things that we were very proud of was the gender diversity. Is that at the moment Citibank they have a plan to hire 1,000 Bahraini coders over 10 years. They are already above 200 coders at the moment. More than 20% of those coders are females, and looking at their other centers, there are other centers that they have with less than 5% of gender diversity. So, and the low turnover that they have in Bahrain. So, and the reason is because, again, Bahrain was always focused on making sure anybody today in Bahrain could go and apply, again, with our labor fund to learn a certain skill. And I think one of the other amazing stories is, is that, and that will probably come up in the next session, so I don't want to steal away from my other colleague in the room, but AWS, apparently, and this is an information that came to us, is that Bahrainis are AWS certified. Probably the ratio of Bahrainis that have that certificate is probably one of the highest in the world. Why? Because again, the leadership in the country are really focused on making sure they will support anything that is required to make sure we have the right skills, we have the right talent. So that's one.
Ed, I'll bring us back to this part of the world. You mentioned Mexico earlier, and they recently had a very interesting election. What have you seen in terms of the impacts, not of U.S.-China tensions, but of what's going on in this hemisphere?
Yeah, I think we all talk about nearshoring and reshoring, and the truth of the matter is it is definitely happening in northern Mexico. I think Nuevo León is getting 75% of the foreign direct investment going into Mexico. And the great news for us in Texas is that they're our neighbors. They're next door, and you have a lot of integration between those two economies. Specifically in the automotive market, you have some major OEMs in Central Texas. Tesla, obviously, of course, here, and you see the same in northern Mexico. And there's just a lot of exchange. Texas has grown at 7% over the last year. We're the fastest growing state. When you project out decades in the future, I really think Central Texas, from Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, and Houston, is going to be the heartbeat of the United States. And so Mexico is going to play a huge role of that and supporting it. And when we think about the geopolitical situation, I think you see the rise of regional systems, and this North American system is going to be one of the top three powerhouses, and we're right in the heart of it. So it's going to be interesting to see the way it develops, but I'm very bullish on the direction we're headed.
And maybe just adding to that, right? I think one of the issues we had in the U.S. for a few years is labor market, right, and just inability to sort of hire talent. And then Mexico's been playing a critical role in that, as far as, availability of technical talent, engineering, supply chain skills actually. So I have multiple global clients that actually built supply chain hubs in Mexico to support operations in the US just because we've been so talent constrained. So it's been an interesting complement to the growth in the US economy.
Yeah, and these are not just laborers, these are
Yeah.
skilled workers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
People are building analytics and like fairly advanced hubs in Monterrey, right, and in the area to support US operations.
I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but I'll just let our audience know that we will have time for questions from the audience at the end, so feel free to start pondering what you might ask. I'm interested in, so, you know, a couple of years ago we were hearing about supply chains all over the place, and they were really in the spotlight of the global conversation. Now that has started to subside, but I think supply chain leaders and what happens in supply chains can continue to drive the climate in a business as a whole. And I'm curious how supply chain leaders can continue to think of themselves as advancing the interests of the business altogether. Maybe Mark, you can start.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a renaissance to, like, you know, for people who've kind of spent a long time in supply chain as I have, to finally have a seat at the table, and because we had something to say, just no one would listen to us. Yeah, I mean, I think in general, people look at supply chains post-COVID as, oh, we need to understand this, because this is something that is boring. It's kind of like an offensive line in football. If it's doing its job, you never notice it until things go badly. And I think supply chains are the same way. That I think people have a much more attuned radar to risk, and I think there is a healthy process that's come out of COVID and regarding disaster recovery and business continuity planning and contingency planning and that type of thing. And I think that's wonderful. I think we need to continue to look at that and not get complacent.
Roman, you want to add to that?
Absolutely, I wholeheartedly agree, and it's exciting to see this many supply chain leaders have a seat at the table. I think one of the KPIs I've been mentally tracking is how many CPO, supply chain leaders, are in front of their boards. And it's never been this high, right? And now they actually are in the spotlight in the most important conversations. So I think that's really important. I think one of the pieces that the value can do is, I think supply chain leaders can be really proactive today. We just went through a period of inflation, right? They can bring a lot of value, recover inflation, right? There's very clear value on the table. And I think supply chains don't have to be that reactive, right? So I think there's a real opportunity to go on offense, as I would say. And to come back to company leadership and say, hey, this is what we can deliver, right? And this is the opportunity. Granted, I need investment and I need improvement, but the ROI is extremely clear. And to give you an example, I had one client CFO essentially frame the whole supply chain story as, put it in a sense of the investment kind of relative to multiple. And he came to a math that said, hey, if I'm buying my own stock, I'm paying 10x. If I'm doing M&A, I'm paying more than that. If I'm doing supply chain transformation and capturing sustainable value, that's, you know, fractions of a multiple. There's no better way to buy sustainable EBIT, right? And
you know, one thing I haven't mentioned before now is I think the easy thing to do is just buy a bunch of inventory. Like that's the dumb way to do it. But I think if you're thoughtful about it and you're able to partner with suppliers and have under contract, having them hold strategic inventory, long lead time, critical inventory that is not easily replaced, and maybe with their suppliers, maybe with a tier 3 supplier, really triaging and understanding the bills of material that you have, that your suppliers have, and really kind of going deep. You don't have to hold everything, but holding a few things could cut lead time from 9 months to 2 months with just a small investment.
Interesting. Do we have any questions from the audience? Are we waiting for a mic? Or are we? Yeah. Sorry.
This question for Ahmed. My name is Rudy. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, great. So I know you talked about a lot of incentives in Bahrain. You know, given the fact that Saudi is on a tear in terms of growth, and Dubai being the global city it is, with the incentives you talked about in Bahrain, how do you still differentiate yourselves from the rest of the Gulf region as a place that offers incentives for companies to be interested?
Thank you for the question, Rudy. And I think we're so happy that the growth that's happening in Saudi Arabia, UAE is there because every momentum that's going around there is helping Bahrain because first of all, we are not in competition. We play a complementary role when it comes to investments, especially in the Gulf. Commercially, politically, Bahrain, enjoys an extreme strong relationship with its peers in the region and the GCC. Very strong commitment from both countries that you just mentioned towards Bahrain and towards investment in Bahrain. Most of our manufacturers that are in Bahrain are actually serving those regions more than, it's not the local market, it's a small market. So actually, whatever growth happens there is good for us because we still allow companies to come and base yourself in Bahrain, do a pilot program, do a smaller manufacturing facility, and serve what's going on there. The incentives, I think one of the main advantages is the cost of doing business. Our leadership, His Royal Highness, Crown Prince and Prime Minister, who happens to be also the chairman of the Economic Development Board, every 2 years he asks, are we competitive enough? And we have an independent party that does the cost of doing business for us. The last one that we had was showing that Bahrain is cheaper when it comes to manufacturing by more than 50%, cheaper in logistics by more than 70%. And I can guarantee you we are not cheaper in every cost element, but when you look at it holistically, we can offer a much cheaper cost environment for doing business. As I said, local talent is available, and if it's not, we will make sure that we will work on it. Quality of living, and I'm not being a Bahraini, I'm not being biased, but I guess if you look at the ratio of expats in Bahrain, that's a testimony by itself of the quality of living. A lot of companies actually, they do go around and then they come back to Bahrain, they say, we want to do business. And most of the expats that are in Bahrain, and let's say they have a contract with a company for 10 years, 15 years, they never leave. It's because the quality of living, as soon as you land in Bahrain as an expat, you will find yourself blending immediately. We don't have separate communities for expats or locals. As soon as you land, you blend in, you'll find yourself invited in somebody's house for dinner or lunch. I still remember the CEO of Citibank telling me once, he landed in Bahrain and he knew only one person. A month later, he almost knew everybody. and that's the advantage of being, and I guess as an island, and we've been a trading hub for more than 4,000 years. So we've been always receptive for, people coming in and going out. So I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Just speaking locally, I'm sure the companies in the room would agree, if I might have heard you correct, that a 0% tax is hard to compete with. I think that's pretty good, offering. So.
I think we had another question. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the question is for Roman. So I think the current companies are beginning to figure out that as they try to drive transformation, it's not as easy as it sounds, right? Some of the recent happenings that have kind of helped companies understand how exposed their supply chain is to geopolitics and all of that. Now, and when they try to decouple, it's not easy to decouple to go take advantage of some of the incentives like Ahmed has talked about, right? So I'm curious to, what are some of the experience you've had with clients who have faced some of these challenges with decoupling their supply chain, and how have you helped them kind of navigate some of the issues to maybe go take incentives like Ahmed talked about?
Well, I think, no, that's a great question. And I think a little bit it goes to what you raised, right? First you got to set sort of what are your principles for supply chain and in your world, right? And how do you think about it differently? Because there's so many sole source relationships that we got comfortable with, or dependencies on particular geographies or risks, right? That when you actually did their honest risk mapping, you very quickly realized you were deeply exposed, right, to kind of very few issues. So I think a couple things, a couple good principles to follow, right, that companies are starting to adopt is like, hey, I need to reduce my level of vulnerability, and I need to create, I need to kind of open the aperture of what scenarios I'm planning for. Because I think what we all have gotten collectively complacent about is the scenario planning around kind of states of the world, right? For a longest time, I think the scenario planning in most of Western world was inflation being 1% to 3%, basically. Thereabouts, right? But you know what I mean? Like there's no black swan events in any of that picture, and nobody planned for any of it. Now, I think what you need to open is the aperture to say, if 80% of my supply comes from China, what may happen in the next 10 years, and what's a black swan event around that? Can I depend on it? If I'm not, then in the long run, within several years, you can decouple yourself from most anything. But you got to have a kind of strong enough business case and clear conviction that it's the right thing to do. And be able to articulate, how to do it with with your leadership. I think the other piece of it, a lot of supply chain leaders struggle with the business case to do that, right? Because it's easy to say, once you say, hey, I want to decouple from my supply chain, what it means is increased cost, right? That's the first reaction everybody has. The reality, I think every organization mostly has quite a lot of cost they can still deliver and efficiency they can still deliver. So you got to do it in parallel with maturing your other practices, right? If you go after the total cost of ownership, supplier innovation, right? Don't do it in a blunt way, right? Like do it through partnering with suppliers and some of the things Mark was saying it, right? There's a sophisticated way to do it to balance risk and efficiency, but it can be simplistic, right? And I think some companies just run into it a little too simplistically.
Maybe we'll take one more question. I think we had, let's take that one.
Hi, thank you. This is a great panel, learning quite a bit. My question, please, is for you, Ahmed, related to, there's a number of startups that I have the pleasure of advising. Could you talk about any challenges that startups with patents may have related to doing any manufacturing in Bahrain? Thank you.
Well, I mean, we've got a number of initiatives when it comes to startup, not necessarily sitting with the Economic Development Board. We've got, I think, Tamkeen, our labor fund, has an initiative covering startups. We've got also I think Bahrain Development Bank has also something else on startups. But we definitely, it's something that we, again, endorse and support as well. I can give you more information if you share with me your contacts, but it's not something that, directly under the umbrella of the Economic Development Board. We've got other sister companies that look at startups. And probably the second session, maybe my colleague can share more light on that.
Very good. Thank you.
Should we take one on this side of the room? I feel like we've been over here a lot. I did see some hands before. Were there? Yeah.
So Roman and Mark enumerated some risk. I'd like to actually hear, what are the other risks that, we don't have to go into details, but what are the other risks that you guys see that we need to be paying attention to? It'd be great to actually kind of get a higher level, view of risk that you see that we need to start paying attention to.
I guess I would categorize those into kind of slow-moving risks and fast-moving ones. I guess the ones that bother me the most are probably geopolitical, like God forbid if something happens to Taiwan, and how that could potentially impact the semiconductor supply chain. I think we all have to kind of look at our semiconductor and chip supply as something that could change dramatically. And to the question earlier, like in terms of decoupling, you don't have to move. You just need to be ready to move. Like have that second supplier waiting in the rings, ready to go, qualified, vetted, contracted, so that if you have to shift the supply, you're ready to go. And then there's kind of slow-moving risk, right? Like labor shortages, automation. You can get ahead of those things, I think, because you can kind of see those coming.
I think maybe a couple other, depending what industry you're in, right? Extreme weather events are becoming a real issue, right? I work a lot with utilities and energy, right? You see what's happening with insurance markets and such, right? So I think we have not historically quantified those well, right? And it can have huge implications. I think our utilities in Texas naturally a live example of how to underestimate potential exposure to something, right? Like we saw a couple of years ago, and then realize that events can be far larger than. So I think we got to model kind of much wider outcomes around extreme weather events, broadly speaking, be it wildfires, hurricanes, heat, anything else. I think the whole energy infrastructure, right, is getting shakier. So, and part of the problem in Mexico has been that, right? Is like the electrical grid is just not there to support more investment. If not, it would be there. And so, how do you sort of kind of protect those fundamentals? And I think this whole topic of, artificial intelligence, I know we didn't talk about it. It feels like worthy bringing it up in the last second. We don't know what the outcome is going to be, right? There's a lot of hype around it, clearly, but it also is creating a lot of efficiency, right, that people are starting to look into. And it can be really disruptive potentially. So at least we should consider what are the possible outcomes if it actually does play out as planned, right? What if we can become twice as productive, or suppliers become twice as efficient, right? Or like, what are those extreme edge cases, and what does it do for you, right?
Yeah, I'm bullish on AI just because I think global supply chains are so multifactorial and dynamic and hard to assess, and we just try to look at them as best we can. And I think the insights from AI will be able to say, hey, you need to think about this, this, and this that you may not be necessarily on your radar, and I'm excited about that.
Unfortunately, we have to bring this to a close, but thank you so much to all of our speakers, and thank you so much to the audience for being so engaged. Before we close up, I just want to take a moment to reflect on some of the things that we've been discussing. I think there were a few themes that we touched on that I think are important in a lot of different ways: the impact of global events on business and supply chains, how technology is changing how we operate, and how supply chain leaders can play a stronger role in their businesses. Some of the points that I found especially interesting thinking back, this concept of having multiple qualified suppliers and being ready at any moment to move to a new supplier if necessary. The concept that Alice Marie mentioned this morning earlier about sustainability being an advantage, and especially as we're thinking about climate change, how can we not see this as a requirement but something that we can actually benefit from. And this concept of supply chain leaders now having a seat at the table, and the ways that their knowledge of how to manage risk can be brought throughout organizations. Thinking forward, where we're concerned about the risks from potential war, from the continuing effects of climate change, and how we'll adapt to those. But I think that that's a conversation for another time. So thank you all again. Before we sort of stand up, I'll mention that our next step is a round of speed networking. We'll all move to the back of the room where there will be 4 tables. And I would encourage you to go to a table with some people who you don't already know. There's a topic for each table, and you'll spend just 5 minutes talking about the topic on your table. And then I think a bell will ring, or there will be some indication that we will switch. And we'll move to another table and have a different discussion. And I'll just tell you what all of the topics are. So there's one on what do you see as the major global challenge facing your manufacturing and supply changes in the short or near term. One on how can supply chain and logistics leaders better collaborate with other business functions to drive efficiency and productivity. One on technology and the price that can be attached to it, and as well as the promise, and how firms can invest in technology without breaking the bank. And the 4th is on what companies should be doing to increase their supplier visibility. So as I mentioned, please move to the tables in the back, and after we do 15 minutes of speed networking, there will be lunch afterwards. And I will remind you again that we do have our salon this afternoon that you're welcome to stay for, the Battle for Tech Talent. And please do scan the QR code to hear about our FinTech Forward event in October. Thank you all so much.